Early 1944, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The winter air was bitter cold, but inside the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, the test pilot felt only the familiar warmth of the Merlin engine vibrating through the airframe. He had flown this aircraft dozens of times before, knew its quirks and capabilities, understood exactly what it could and couldn't do. But today was different. Today, the ground crew had pumped something new into the fuel tanks, a purple-tinted liquid that looked strange in the sunlight, almost unnatural. They called it Grade 150, and the engineers on the ground were watching with an intensity that made even a veteran test pilot slightly nervous. He steadied his hand on the throttle, feeling the familiar resistance as he pushed it forward. But instead of stopping at the standard war emergency power setting, he kept pushing. The throttle moved past the safety stop, past the limit he'd been trained never to exceed. The engine's note changed immediately, rising from its usual powerful roar to something more urgent, almost angry. The boost pressure gauge climbed steadily, the needle sweeping past numbers he'd never seen in this aircraft. 67 inches of mercury, 70 inches, 73, 75. The manifold pressure was reading numbers that should have destroyed the engine, that should have caused catastrophic detonation and sent him tumbling from the sky in a ball of flame. But the engine held. More than held, it sang. The airspeed indicator began moving with a speed that startled him. He was already at 25,000 feet, in the thin, cold air where engines struggled for breath, where every mile per hour was hard-won against the drag of the atmosphere. Yet the Mustang was accelerating like it was at sea level. 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. The needle kept climbing, 448 miles per hour. He keyed his radio, trying to keep his voice professional despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The numbers he was reading couldn't be right, but when he cross-checked with his stopwatch and the landmarks below, they were accurate. He was flying faster than any Mustang had ever flown before, and the engine temperature gauges were all reading normal. Whatever was in those fuel tanks, it had just changed everything. On the ground at Wright Field, the test engineers exchanged glances that mixed excitement with disbelief. They'd hoped for improvement, certainly. The British reports had been promising. But this was beyond their projections. One of them, a former petroleum chemist from Standard Oil who'd been recruited into military service, stood watching the data streaming in from the telemetry instruments with something close to awe. He'd spent 3 years of his life working on the chemistry that had produced this fuel. Countless hours in laboratories mixing compounds, testing blends, analyzing results. And now, watching that Mustang carve through the Ohio sky at speeds that defied previous limitations, he understood that they'd achieved something remarkable. This was not an incremental improvement, not a modest gain measured in single-digit percentages. This was a revolution wrapped in purple-dyed aviation gasoline, a chemical advantage so profound that it would render obsolete every assumption the Luftwaffe held about American fighter capabilities. The war in Europe was about to change in ways that German intelligence officers couldn't imagine, wouldn't believe even when their own pilots reported it. The catalyst for this change was not a new aircraft design, not a brilliant tactical innovation, not a wonder weapon conjured from the drawing boards of engineers. It was fuel, simple aviation gasoline, but refined and blended with a sophistication that allowed existing fighters to perform at levels that defied German expectations and German capabilities. What the Luftwaffe did not yet know, what their intelligence services had not yet discovered, what their own fuel chemists had not yet achieved, was that American and British petroleum engineers had accomplished something that the Third Reich's synthetic fuel program could never match. The gap wasn't small, wasn't something that could be closed with additional effort or resources. It was fundamental, rooted in the basic realities of Germany's strategic situation. Germany had almost no natural petroleum reserves. They had coal, vast quantities of coal, and they had developed ingenious processes to convert that coal into liquid fuel. But these processes, however clever, however scientifically sophisticated, had limitations that couldn't be overcome. The German B-4 fuel, their standard aviation gasoline, was rated at 87 octane on the lean mixture scale. It was produced through the Burgess process, a coal hydrogenation method that involved crushing coal into fine powder, mixing it with heavy oil to create a paste, then subjecting this mixture to extreme pressure and temperature in the presence of a catalyst. The coal was literally squeezed and cooked until it broke down into lighter hydrocarbons that could be distilled into something resembling gasoline. It was an industrial marvel, a testament to German chemical engineering prowess. But it was also slow, expensive, and produced fuel with inherent limitations. The Germans did have better fuel, their C3 grade, which they painted on fuel caps with distinctive green triangles. This fuel was closer to Allied quality, roughly equivalent to the American 130 grade, with a lean mixture rating of about 97 octane and a rich mixture performance number approaching 130. But producing C3 required adding iso-octane to the B4 base fuel, and iso-octane production was itself a complex multi-step process. Coal had to be gasified with steam and oxygen. The resulting gas had to be scrubbed of sulfur and other impurities with ammonia. The cleaned gas was then passed over chromium catalysts to produce butanol, which was then dehydrated through multiple steps to create butene, which could finally be polymerized into iso-octane. Each step required specialized equipment, rare catalysts, enormous amounts of energy, and skilled workers. The entire process was so resource-intensive that it had been compared to building a third of the United States Navy in terms of industrial investment. And even when all these steps were completed successfully, Germany could only produce enough C3 fuel for a portion of their fighter force. Many Messerschmitt 109s flew on B4. Most Focke-Wulf 190s used B4 unless they were assigned to critical units. Bombers almost always used B4. Only the elite fighter units, the Luftwaffe squadrons tasked with intercepting American bomber formations, received consistent allocations of C3. By contrast, American refineries were producing aviation gasoline with a performance number of 150. The number itself tells the story. A German pilot in a Messerschmitt 109 running C3 fuel could push his engine to performance levels roughly equivalent to an American pilot in a Mustang running 130 grade fuel. It was a technological parity, an even match. But when that American pilot's fuel tanks were filled with 150 grade fuel, the equation changed completely. The Mustang could suddenly sustain manifold pressures that would have destroyed German engines. It could generate horsepower levels that exceeded German capabilities. It could achieve speeds that German fighters simply could not match. The implications were staggering, though it would take time for those implications to become fully apparent. Consider a specific scenario, one that would be repeated hundreds of times in the skies over Germany in 1944 and 1945. A formation of American B-17 bombers flying at 25,000 feet, approaching a target deep in German territory. German radar stations have detected them, tracking their course. Luftwaffe fighter control centers scramble interceptor units. Messerschmitt 109G models climb to altitude. Their pilots experienced men who've survived months or years of aerial combat. Men who understand their aircraft's capabilities intimately. These German pilots know their best chance is a high-speed diving attack from above. They climb to 30,000 feet, position themselves up-sun from the bomber formation, then roll into their attack dives. As they plunge downward, their airspeed builds. 400 miles per hour, 420. Their Daimler-Benz engines, running on C3 fuel if they're lucky, or B4 if they're not, are at maximum power. The pilots line up their gun sights on the bombers, fingers tightening on the firing buttons, but there are P-51 Mustangs escorting those bombers, and a Mustang pilot flying top cover at 28,000 feet, spots the German fighters beginning their attack run. He doesn't hesitate. He rolls his Mustang inverted and pulls through, entering his own dive. His Mustang is running on standard 130 grade fuel. He knows from experience and training that he can catch the German fighters, but it will be close. The 109s have gravity assisting them, accelerating them toward the bombers. He'll intercept them, probably, but it will require perfect positioning, precise timing, aggressive pursuit. Now imagine that same scenario 6 months later. The same German fighters, the same attack profile, the same tactical situation. But this time, that Mustang pilot's fuel tanks are filled with 150 grade fuel. When he rolls into his pursuit dive, when he advances his throttle to war emergency power, his engine develops 1,720 horsepower instead of 1,490. The difference is immediate and dramatic. He accelerates faster. He closes the distance more quickly. What was a close run interception becomes a comfortable pursuit. He reaches the German fighters while they're still setting up their attack, before they can fire on the bombers. The 109 pilots, glancing back, seeing the Mustang closing on them impossibly fast, must make a choice: break off their attack and try to escape, or press on and almost certainly be shot down. Most choose to break off, but here's where the fuel advantage becomes even more decisive. In the old scenario, with 130 grade fuel, if a German pilot decided to run, to push his throttle forward and dive away at maximum speed, the Mustang pilot faced a difficult decision: chase or protect the bombers. If he chased aggressively, he might catch the German fighter, but he'd burn a lot of fuel doing it, and he'd leave the bombers less protected. Often, discretion suggested letting the German fighter go, maintaining position, conserving fuel for the long flight home. But with 150 grade fuel, the equation changes. The Mustang is so much faster that the German fighter isn't escaping. The 109, even in a full-power dive, might reach 420 miles per hour. The Mustang, running on 150 grade fuel at altitude, can sustain 448 miles per hour. The German pilot can't run fast enough, can't dive away, can't extend and escape. He's caught, and he knows it. And knowing it, knowing that attempting to run will just result in being shot down from behind, German pilots increasingly chose not to attack at all. Better to preserve the aircraft and live to fly another day than to die in an engagement that can't be won. This is what 150 grade fuel accomplished. It didn't just make American fighters faster, it made them faster enough to fundamentally alter German tactical options. It compressed the decision space that German pilots operated in. It took away their escape routes. It forced them into increasingly untenable positions where every choice was bad, and some were catastrophically bad. German fighter pilots, who had learned to respect the Mustang's range and high altitude performance, were about to discover that the Americans had fundamentally altered the equation of aerial combat. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter in early 1944, had a maximum speed of 400 miles per hour at altitude. The Focke-Wulf 190 could reach 408 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Against Mustangs running 130 grade fuel, German pilots could at least attempt engagement on favorable terms. Against Mustangs running 150 grade fuel, German fighters were operating at a fundamental disadvantage that no amount of pilot skill or tactical cunning could overcome. The story of how this advantage came to exist begins not with the war, but with work that started more than a decade before the first shots were fired in Poland. In the early 1930s, aviation was transforming from a novelty into a strategic asset. Aircraft were getting faster, flying higher, and military planners were beginning to understand that future wars would be fought in 3 dimensions. But there was a problem, and the problem was fuel. The gasoline available for aircraft engines was basically the same fuel used in automobiles, with octane ratings in the 70s or low 80s. This was barely adequate for the relatively low compression engines of early aircraft. As engine designers pushed for more power, trying to extract more horsepower from each pound of engine weight, they kept running into the same barrier: detonation. Detonation, sometimes called knock or ping, occurs when the air-fuel mixture in an engine's cylinder ignites spontaneously before the spark plug fires. Instead of a controlled burn spreading smoothly across the combustion chamber, you get an uncontrolled explosion that sends shock waves ricocheting around the cylinder. These shock waves create the characteristic knocking sound, but more importantly, they cause tremendous thermal and mechanical stress. Continued detonation would quickly destroy an engine, melting pistons, shattering connecting rods, cracking cylinder heads. The solution, engine designers knew, was higher octane fuel. Octane rating measured how resistant a fuel was to this spontaneous ignition. The higher the octane number, the more compression the fuel could withstand before detonating. Higher compression meant more power. But in the early 30s, producing high-octane fuel at the volumes needed for aviation was expensive and technically challenging. Enter General James Doolittle, who would later become famous for leading the Tokyo raid in 1942, but who in the 1930s was an engineer, a test pilot, and an aviation fuel evangelist. Doolittle had earned a doctorate from MIT studying the relationship between fuel octane and engine performance. He understood better than almost anyone that fuel quality was going to determine which nations controlled the air in any future war. He became, in effect, a lobbyist for high-octane aviation fuel, traveling between military offices and oil company boardrooms, arguing, cajoling, persuading, sometimes browbeating people into understanding that investment in fuel technology was as important as investment in aircraft technology. His message was simple but profound. You can design the most aerodynamically efficient airframe in the world. You can engineer an engine with perfect metallurgy and optimal thermodynamics. But if you're feeding that engine low-octane fuel, you're leaving performance on the table. Worse, your enemy with better fuel will have aircraft that perform better with less sophisticated designs. The side with superior fuel can win the air war even if their aircraft designs are inferior. The oil companies listened, eventually. Standard Oil, Shell, and others began investing in research into fuel additives and refining processes. The key breakthrough came with tetraethyl lead, a compound that, when added to gasoline in small quantities, dramatically increased octane rating. Tetraethyl lead worked by interfering with the chemical chain reactions that caused spontaneous ignition. It was toxic. Handling it required precautions, but it was remarkably effective. Adding just a few cubic centimeters of tetraethyl lead per gallon could boost octane numbers by 10 or 15 points, but tetraethyl lead alone wasn't enough. To get really high octane numbers, you needed to change the molecular composition of the base gasoline. This meant developing new refining processes. Catalytic cracking, developed by a French immigrant engineer named Eugene Houdry, could break down heavy petroleum fractions into lighter, higher-octane components. Alkylation processes could combine light hydrocarbons into higher-octane compounds. These weren't simple improvements to existing refining methods. They required entirely new industrial infrastructure, new reaction vessels, new catalysts, new quality control procedures. American and British oil companies, encouraged by people like Doolittle and eventually mandated by their governments, made these investments. By 1940, when war was raging in Europe but America remained neutral, these investments were starting to pay off. American refineries could produce 100-octane fuel in meaningful quantities. When Britain faced the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940, fighting for its survival in what would be called the Battle of Britain, high-octane fuel made a measurable difference. British Spitfires and Hurricanes, running on 100-octane fuel, suddenly had 30 to 40 more miles per hour of maximum speed, compared to what those same aircraft achieved on lower-octane fuel. Climb rates improved by 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. These weren't trivial improvements. In aerial combat, where engagements might be decided by seconds, where being able to climb 100 feet higher or fly 10 miles per hour faster could mean the difference between shooting down an enemy aircraft or being shot down yourself. These fuel-derived advantages mattered enormously. In 1940, when the war was already raging in Europe, American aviation fuel production centered on 87-octane gasoline. This was adequate for commercial aviation and early military trainers, but woefully insufficient for high-performance combat aircraft. The British, desperate for any advantage against the Luftwaffe's superior numbers, had worked with American oil companies to develop 100-octane fuel, which became available just in time for the Battle of Britain. The difference was immediately apparent. British Spitfires and Hurricanes using 100-octane fuel suddenly had 30 to 40 miles per hour more speed at altitude, and climb rates increased by 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. German pilots who had enjoyed performance advantages with their fuel suddenly found themselves on even terms. The development of 130-grade fuel provided another leap forward. This fuel, with its performance number of 130 on rich mixture settings, became the backbone of Allied air power through 1943. It powered the Merlin engines in both Spitfires and Mustangs, the Allison engines in P-38 Lightnings, and the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radials in P-47 Thunderbolts. Production scaled rapidly under the direction of pioneering aviation fuel advocate General James Doolittle, who had worked tirelessly in the 1930s to convince both the military and oil companies to invest in high-octane fuel development. By 1943, 17 Allied refineries were producing high-octane aviation gasoline using the catalytic cracking process. American refineries alone were producing millions of gallons monthly, enough to fuel the massive bomber offensive against Germany and the growing fighter forces that protected those bombers. German fuel production, by contrast, remained bottlenecked by their reliance on synthetic fuel derived from coal. The Burgess process that converted German coal into aviation gasoline was technically sound, but slow and resource-intensive. Even at peak production, Germany could produce only a fraction of the high-octane fuel that flowed from American refineries. Most German fighters flew on B-4 fuel rated at approximately 87 octane. Their premium C3 fuel, used primarily in BMW 801-powered Focke-Wulf 190s and select Messerschmitt variants, was roughly equivalent to Allied 130-grade fuel, but available in far more limited quantities. By 1944, perhaps two-thirds of German aviation fuel production was C3 grade. But this still represented only a small fraction of what the Allies were producing. Understanding fuel performance requires grasping a fundamental principle of internal combustion engines. Octane ratings measure detonation resistance. When a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture during the compression stroke, temperature and pressure increase dramatically. If the fuel spontaneously ignites before the spark plug fires, the result is detonation, an uncontrolled explosion rather than a controlled burn. Detonation creates shock waves that damage or destroy engine components. Higher octane ratings mean the fuel can withstand higher compression without. Detonating octane ratings, by definition, cannot exceed 100 because 100 octane means detonation resistance equivalent to pure isooctane, the reference standard. Performance numbers measure how much better than pure isooctane a fuel can perform. A fuel with a performance number of 150 means it can withstand 50% more compression than pure isooctane before detonating. Creating such a fuel required adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, and careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons, like toluene and xylene with the base gasoline. British fuel chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tested numerous blends through 1942 and 1943, seeking the optimal combination of anti-knock performance, energy content, and manufacturing practicality. American researchers at Wright Field conducted parallel investigations, sharing data with their British counterparts. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches of what they designated as 150-grade fuel. The designation was somewhat misleading because it implied an octane rating of 150, which was chemically impossible. What it actually meant was a fuel with a performance number of 150 on the rich mixture scale combined with 100 octane performance on the lean mixture scale. This fuel, dyed purple for easy identification, underwent extensive testing through 1943. The results exceeded expectations. Merlin engines running on 150-grade fuel could sustain manifold pressure readings of 75 inches of mercury compared to 67 inches on 130-grade fuel. This translated directly into increased horsepower. A Packard Merlin V1650-7, the engine that powered the P-51 Mustang, generated 1,490 horsepower at standard military power on 130-grade fuel. The same engine running on 150-grade fuel at war emergency power settings generated 1,720 horsepower. In the P-51B with its V1650-3 Merlin variant, the power increase pushed output to approximately 1,600 horsepower. Flight testing at Wright Field confirmed that the performance gains were substantial across all flight regimes. Maximum speed increased by approximately 25 to 30 miles per hour at altitude. Climb rate improved by several hundred feet per minute. Most importantly, these improvements came with no modifications to the aircraft itself. The same Mustang flown one day on 130-grade fuel and the next day on 150-grade fuel became measurably faster and more capable simply because of what flowed through its fuel lines. The decision to introduce 150-grade fuel to operational fighter squadrons was made in early 1944. The timing was carefully considered. The 8th Air Force, based in England and conducting daylight strategic bombing raids deep into Germany, was suffering unsustainable losses. Despite the arrival of the first P-51 Mustangs in December 1943, German fighter forces were still inflicting heavy casualties on American bomber formations. What American planners needed was not just an escort fighter with long range, but an escort fighter so fast that German interceptors could not easily escape or refuse combat on unfavorable terms. In May 1944, the first operational deliveries of 150-grade fuel arrived in England. Distribution was carefully controlled. Not every fighter group received the new fuel immediately. The 8th Air Force began with select squadrons, both to manage supply logistics and to evaluate combat performance. The British Royal Air Force, which had pioneered much of the early testing, also began equipping fighter squadrons with the new fuel. Priority went to units tasked with high-speed interception missions, particularly those hunting German V-1 flying bombs that were beginning to terrorize London in June 1944. The V-1 flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at low altitude, following a pre-programmed course toward London with mechanical precision. These early cruise missiles were terror weapons, designed not for military targets, but to break civilian morale. They arrived without warning, their distinctive pulse jet engines earning them the nickname buzz bombs from Londoners who learned to dread their sound. When the engine cut out, when the characteristic buzzing stopped, you had perhaps 15 seconds before the warhead detonated. 15 seconds to find cover, to pray, to hope it wouldn't land on you. Intercepting these weapons required fighter aircraft capable of matching or exceeding that speed at sea level or low altitude, where air density reduced the performance of all aircraft. This was a challenge. Aircraft engines produce less power at high altitude, where air is thin, but they also produce less power at very low altitude, where the air is dense and creates more drag. The sweet spot for most World War II fighters was between 10,000 and 25,000 feet. Down at the altitudes where V-1s flew, 2,000 feet or lower, aircraft performance suffered. Hawker Tempests, big, powerful fighters with massive Napier Sabre engines, could barely catch the V-1s. These were among the fastest aircraft in the Royal Air Force inventory. capable of over 430 miles per hour at optimal altitude. But at low level, chasing V-1s, they were marginally faster. A Tempest pilot had to position perfectly, build up speed carefully, manage his intercept angle precisely. If everything went right, he could pull alongside a V-1 and shoot it down. If the intercept geometry was poor, if he started from the wrong position, the V-1 would simply outrun him. Spitfire. Pointfuse, the latest evolution of Britain's most famous fighter, fitted with powerful Rolls-Royce Griffon engines instead of the traditional Merlins, had similar performance. Fast enough to catch V-1s, but only just, and only if everything went perfectly. Many V-1s made it through to their targets simply because the intercepting fighters couldn't catch them in time. Mustangs running standard 130 grade fuel were marginal interceptors. They could catch some V-1s, but it required favorable positioning and good luck. The margin was too small, the window of opportunity too narrow. But Mustangs running 150 grade fuel had sufficient speed margin to intercept reliably. The difference between 437 miles per hour and 448 miles per hour doesn't sound like much. It's 11 miles per hour, barely 2%. But in the specific tactical situation of V-1 interception, that 11 miles per hour made the difference between success and failure. A Mustang pilot with 150 grade fuel could intercept V-1s from positions that would have been hopeless with standard fuel. He didn't need perfect geometry. He didn't need ideal circumstances. He had enough speed advantage to compensate for imperfect positioning. He could catch V-1s that would have escaped other interceptors. On June 18, 1944, just 12 days after D-Day, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron was on patrol over southern England when he spotted a V-1 heading toward London. He turned to intercept, advancing his throttle to maximum power. His Mustang accelerated smoothly, the purple fuel in his tanks enabling boost pressures that would have been dangerous with standard fuel. He closed on the V-1, positioning his Mustang just off its wing. What happened next demonstrates both the creativity of fighter pilots and the performance margin that 150 grade fuel provided. Turner didn't shoot the V-1 down. He tipped it over using his wing. The technique required flying formation with the unmanned bomb, positioning his wingtip within 6 inches of the V-1's wing surface. At that distance, the airflow from the Mustang's wing disturbed the airflow over the V-1's wing. By precisely positioning his aircraft, Turner could create enough aerodynamic disruption to roll the V-1 onto its back. Once inverted, the V-1's primitive gyroscopic guidance system couldn't compensate. The bomb would spiral into the ground and detonate harmlessly in open countryside. This maneuver was dangerous, requiring exceptional flying skill and nerves of steel. But it was also necessary because sometimes shooting at V-1s was risky. The warhead contained 1,800 pounds of high explosive. If you hit it just wrong, if you detonated the warhead while you were too close, the explosion could damage or destroy your own aircraft. Several Allied pilots were killed or injured when V-1s. They were shooting at exploded too close to them. The wing-tipping technique avoided this risk but required getting even closer to the V-1. You needed precise control. You needed to be flying fast enough to keep pace effortlessly, with enough speed reserve that small adjustments wouldn't cause you to fall behind. You needed, in other words, the performance advantage that 150 grade fuel provided. Turner's successful wingtip on June 18th wasn't the first such maneuver, but it was one of the earliest documented examples. The technique would be used at least 16 more times during the V-1 campaign, almost always by aircraft running 150 grade fuel because other aircraft lacked the performance margin to execute it safely. The first widespread combat use of 150 grade fuel by American P-51 pilots occurred in June 1944, coinciding with the Normandy invasion. Fighter groups of the 8th Air Force, tasked with achieving air superiority over the invasion beaches, flew combat air patrols and bomber escorts using the new fuel. German fighter pilots began reporting encounters with Mustangs that performed beyond what they had previously experienced. Luftwaffe intelligence officers collected pilot reports describing American fighters that could not be caught in any flight regime, that could accelerate away from German interceptors with ease, and that seemed to have power reserves that defied explanation. These reports were initially dismissed as pilot error or exaggeration. German fighter pilots, the intelligence officers reasoned, were tired, outnumbered, and facing mounting losses. Their reports of superior American fighter performance were surely the result of stress and fatigue rather than actual performance increases. This assessment was fundamentally wrong, but the truth would not become clear until after the war. Gerhard Barkhorn, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, mostly achieved on the Eastern Front, flew combat missions against American fighters over Germany in 1944. After the war, in interviews conducted during the 1970s and 80s, Barkhorn spoke about his encounters with late-war Mustangs. He recalled being shocked at the performance of American fighters during the final year of the war. Barkhorn, who would later test fly captured American fighters including the P-51, P-47, and P-38, noted that the Mustang in particular impressed him with its speed, climb capability, and high-altitude performance. What Barkhorn and other German pilots did not realize during combat was that they were facing an aircraft whose performance had been chemically enhanced beyond its designed specifications, operating at power settings that the original Mustang engineers had never envisioned. The Merlin engine, designed by Rolls-Royce and produced under license by Packard, had been engineered with careful attention to thermal limits, bearing loads, and detonation margins. Running an engine at higher boost pressures pushed all of these parameters closer to their limits. What made 150-grade fuel revolutionary was that it allowed engines to operate at these extreme settings without the catastrophic detonation that would have destroyed engines running lower-grade fuels at the same boost pressures. The chemistry behind this capability involved the complex interaction of fuel molecules, air molecules, heat, and pressure inside the engine's combustion chamber. Tetraethyl lead, the primary anti-knock additive, worked by interfering with the chemical chain reactions that led to spontaneous ignition. But there were trade-offs. Tetraethyl lead was toxic, requiring careful handling by ground crews. It left deposits on spark plugs, valves, and cylinder walls, increasing maintenance requirements. 150-grade fuel, with its very high lead content, accelerated these maintenance issues. Fighter groups using the new fuel experienced more frequent spark plug fouling and increased cylinder wear. American maintenance procedures adapted quickly. Spark plug replacement intervals were shortened. Cylinder inspections became more frequent. Engine overhaul schedules were adjusted. The performance gains were judged worth the increased maintenance burden. For pilots, the transition to 150-grade fuel required not just new operating procedures, but a complete recalibration of what they thought their aircraft could do. Lieutenant Robert Henderson, a P-51 pilot with the 361st Fighter Group, described his first flight on 150-grade fuel in a letter home that survived the war. He wrote that the briefing had explained the new fuel, the higher boost pressures it allowed, the increased performance they could expect. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were different things. Henderson's first combat mission on 150-grade fuel came in July 1944, an escort mission to Munich. The bombers were at 24,000 feet. His flight was positioned at 27,000 flying top cover. German fighters appeared above them, Messerschmitt 109s diving from 30,000 feet in a classic bounce. Henderson's flight leader called the attack, and Henderson rolled his Mustang, pulling through into a diving pursuit. He'd done this maneuver dozens of times before. He knew how his Mustang would respond, how fast it would accelerate, how much time he'd need to intercept the German fighters. Except this time, everything happened faster. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power, and the Mustang leaped forward with an urgency he'd never felt before. The manifold pressure gauge showed 75 inches of mercury, numbers he'd never seen in combat. His airspeed built rapidly. He was closing on the German fighters faster than they expected, faster than he expected. What should have been a close-run interception became an easy shot. He fired a burst at a 109 that was still setting up for its attack run on the bombers. The German fighter broke apart under the impact of 50 caliber rounds, pieces spinning away as it tumbled toward the ground. Henderson pulled up, scanning for threats, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the pure adrenaline rush of realizing his aircraft could do things he'd thought impossible. He'd been flying Mustangs for 6 months. He thought he knew the aircraft's capabilities. This fuel had just expanded those capabilities in ways that felt almost unfair. In his letter, he tried to explain the feeling to his parents, who couldn't possibly understand the technical details, but might grasp the emotional impact. He wrote that it was like being a runner who'd trained at a certain speed for months, who knew exactly how fast he could sprint, and then discovering he could suddenly run 20% faster without trying any harder. The new fuel came with challenges, though. Manifold pressure limits were raised from 67 inches to 75 inches of mercury. That was a guideline, a maximum, not a target to maintain constantly. Pilots had to be careful not to overboost engines, particularly at low altitudes where air density was highest. Overboosting could blow cylinder head gaskets, crack cylinder barrels, or cause catastrophic engine failure. The maintenance crews emphasized this in every briefing. The new fuel allowed higher boost, but pilots still needed to exercise judgment about when and how to use that capability. Most significantly, pilots had to learn to manage fuel consumption with even more care than before. The Mustang had been designed with long range as a primary requirement. Internal fuel capacity was 184 gallons, which could be supplemented with drop tanks carrying 75 to 110 gallons each. This gave the Mustang enough range to escort bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. But that range calculation was based on careful fuel management, on cruising at optimal power settings, on using full power only when necessary. 150 grade fuel didn't change the size of the fuel tanks, didn't increase the total gallons available. What it changed was how fast you could burn through those gallons if you used full power. At maximum boost, at 75 inches of mercury, the Merlin engine consumed fuel voraciously. A Mustang pilot who used war emergency power liberally might find himself running low on fuel before reaching home. This required judgment, discipline, tactical awareness. You used the power when you needed it, when the tactical situation demanded it, when shooting down an enemy fighter or evading an attack required maximum performance. But you didn't waste it. You didn't show off. You didn't run at maximum power just because you could. Escort missions to Berlin and back already pushed the Mustang's range to its limits, even with standard fuel and conservative power management. Using 150-grade fuel's full capability meant even more careful fuel management. Pilots learned to run lean of peak during cruise segments, adjusting their mixture controls to extract maximum efficiency. They learned to use altitude to their advantage, climbing high where thinner air reduced fuel consumption. They learned to plan their missions with fuel reserves calculated not for ideal conditions, but for realistic ones that included combat maneuvering, higher-than-planned power settings, winds that might be less favorable than forecast. Ground crews had their own challenges adapting to 150-grade fuel. The high tetraethyl lead content meant special handling procedures. Ground crew members who serviced fuel systems wore protective gloves and sometimes respirators. Tetraethyl lead was toxic. Prolonged exposure could cause lead poisoning, with symptoms ranging from headaches and fatigue to more serious neurological damage. Spills had to be cleaned up immediately, not just for safety, but because tetraethyl lead would damage paint, deteriorate rubber seals, and contaminate other fluids. Fuel trucks carrying 150-grade fuel were painted with prominent purple stripes and labeled in large letters to prevent accidental mixing with standard 130-grade fuel. Mixing fuels would dilute the performance number, negating the advantages of the better fuel while still incurring the maintenance penalties of the higher lead content. Storage tanks at air bases were similarly marked and carefully segregated. The purple color of 150-grade fuel was visible and distinctive. When ground crew members opened fuel caps to check tank levels, when they drew fuel samples to test for water contamination, the purple tint was immediately obvious. This visual distinction helped prevent mix-ups, but it also created a psychological effect. Pilots and ground crew alike came to associate that purple color with superior performance, with extra power, with an advantage over the enemy. The color became almost talismanic, a visible symbol of American industrial and technological superiority. Combat reports from summer and fall 1944 document the transformation. 8th Air Force fighter groups equipped with the new fuel reported higher victory-to-loss ratios and increased ability to intercept German fighters attempting to attack bomber formations. German fighters that had previously been able to make fast slashing attacks and then escape now found themselves unable to outrun pursuing Mustangs. On August 6, 1944, Lieutenant Hollis Bud Nealon of the 357th Fighter Group, flying as part of Operation Frantic missions to Soviet air bases, encountered German fighters over Eastern Europe. Flying his P-51D named Hell's Bells and running 150-grade fuel, Nealon engaged a Messerschmitt Bf-109 flown by Günther Schack. In the ensuing combat, Nealon's speed advantage proved decisive. He closed rapidly on Schack's aircraft and fired a burst that damaged the German fighter's cooling system, low on fuel and ammunition. After the engagement, Nealon broke off pursuit and waved to the German pilot before returning to escort duties. Schack managed to belly land his crippled aircraft near German lines. For 40 years, Schack wondered why the American pilot had not finished him off, never realizing that Nealon had believed he had merely damaged, rather than effectively destroyed, the aircraft. When historians later connected the two pilots and arranged a meeting in Germany, Schack acknowledged that the American's Mustang had demonstrated performance that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The speed with which Nealon had closed and the power reserves evident in the engagement had been unlike previous combats with American fighters. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots was significant. Already outnumbered and facing superior Allied numbers, they now confronted American fighters that seemed to have unlimited performance margins. Their tactical options narrowed dramatically. They could attempt mass attacks, hoping that sheer numbers would overwhelm the escorts. They could refuse combat entirely, preserving their aircraft and pilots. Or they could engage and likely be shot down by Mustangs that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by American pilots who were growing increasingly confident and aggressive. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked upon seeing P-51 Mustangs over Berlin that he knew the war was lost. This comment reflected the Luftwaffe's strategic dilemma. The Mustang's long range meant that nowhere in Germany was safe from American daylight bombing. The introduction of superior fuel in mid-1944 deepened this crisis. Luftwaffe Technical Intelligence eventually obtained samples of Allied 150-grade fuel from captured drop tanks or crashed aircraft. German fuel chemists analyzed the samples and confirmed what Luftwaffe pilots had been reporting. The Americans had developed aviation gasoline with performance characteristics beyond anything German synthetic fuel plants could produce. Some German sources suggested that late-war C3 fuel approached performance numbers of 150, but production was limited and quality was inconsistent. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants, particularly the raids on Leuna and other major facilities in May and June 1944, further constrained German fuel production. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing fuel, Fighter units received priority, but even they operated under tight constraints. Training for new pilots was cut back severely. Many German pilots reached operational units with minimal flying experience compared to American pilots who typically had several hundred hours of training before entering combat. Between January and May 1944, before widespread introduction of 150-grade fuel, American bombers suffered loss rates of approximately 3 to 6% per mission. These were sustainable but painful losses. Between June and December 1944, after the introduction of 150-grade fuel and the achievement of air superiority, loss rates dropped to under 2% per mission. Fighter victories increased dramatically. American P-51 groups across the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces claimed approximately 4,950 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat between late 1943 and May 1945, with a significant portion of those victories coming after June 1944. The German pilot force, which had entered 1944 with substantial experience despite heavy losses on the Eastern Front, was systematically destroyed. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, only 2 Luftwaffe aircraft appeared over the Normandy beaches. The Luftwaffe still possessed thousands of fighters, but lacked the fuel, the trained pilots, and the tactical flexibility to use them effectively. The technical specifications of 150-grade fuel merit examination. The fuel's lean mixture octane rating of 100 meant it resisted detonation as well as pure iso-octane when engines ran at cruising power settings. The fuel's rich mixture performance number of 150 meant it could withstand 50% more compression than iso-octane when engines ran at maximum power. This combination allowed pilots to cruise efficiently for maximum range, then switch to rich mixtures at high power for combat, confident that the engine would not detonate even at extreme boost pressures. The handling procedures for 150-grade fuel required special precautions due to the high tetrethyl lead content. Ground crews wore protective equipment when fueling aircraft. Spills were cleaned up immediately to prevent lead poisoning. Fuel trucks and storage tanks were clearly marked to prevent accidental mixing of fuel grades. Despite these precautions, the safety record was good. Industrial accidents were rare. The transition in operational squadrons required pilot training. Pilots received briefings on the new fuel's properties and updated engine operating procedures. Manifold pressure limits were raised. Operational guidelines specified when and how to use maximum power settings. Aircraft required no modifications. The engines, fuel systems, and all components were compatible with both grades. This compatibility simplified logistics and operations. The production statistics tell a story of industrial mobilization on a scale that Germany could not match, could not even comprehend. Between May 1944 and April 1945, just under 1 year, the 8th Air Force alone consumed over 53 million gallons of 150-grade fuel. This was just one Air Force operating from one theater for 1 year. Allied production across all refineries in the United States and Britain likely exceeded 200 million gallons during this entire operational period. Each gallon of that fuel represented an industrial triumph. Consider what went into producing a single gallon of 150-grade aviation fuel. It started with crude oil, pumped from wells in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and other American oil fields. This crude oil was transported by pipeline or tanker to refineries. At the refinery, the crude oil was heated in giant distillation towers where different petroleum fractions separated based on their boiling points. The fraction appropriate for aviation gasoline was collected. But this was just the beginning. This base gasoline then went through catalytic cracking, where large hydrocarbon molecules were broken into smaller, higher-octane components. The catalyst used in this process was itself a technological achievement, a carefully formulated compound that had to be regenerated continuously as it degraded during the cracking process. After cracking, The fuel went through alkylation, where light hydrocarbons were combined into higher octane branched chain molecules. This required sulfuric acid or hydrofluoric acid as a catalyst, substances dangerous to handle and difficult to work with on industrial scales. Next came the addition of aromatic compounds, toluene and xylene, which increased octane rating but had to be carefully balanced because too much aromatic content reduced the fuel's energy density. The proportions had to be exact, mixed to specifications that allowed no significant deviation. Then came the anti-knock additives, primarily tetraethyl lead, which had to be blended in precise quantities. Too little, and the fuel wouldn't achieve the target performance number. Too much, and the excessive lead would cause unacceptable engine deposits and maintenance problems. After blending, the fuel had to be tested. Quality control laboratories at each refinery performed multiple tests on every batch. Octane rating measured on special test engines. Performance number verified through standardized procedures. Energy content measured to ensure it met minimum specifications. Specific gravity checked. Vapor pressure tested to ensure the fuel would vaporize properly at high altitude. Aromatic content measured to verify it fell within acceptable limits. Water contamination checked, because even small amounts of water could cause icing in aircraft fuel systems at high altitude. Once a batch passed all quality tests, it was approved for distribution. But getting the fuel from American refineries to British air bases was itself a logistical challenge of staggering proportions. The fuel was loaded into tanker ships for the Atlantic crossing, voyages that took days or weeks, and exposed the ships to German U-boat attacks. Dozens of tankers were sunk during the war, taking their cargoes of fuel to the bottom of the Atlantic. Each lost tanker represented not just the fuel itself, but also the refinery capacity, the testing, the labor, the industrial output that had produced it. Tankers that survived the crossing delivered their fuel to British ports, where it was pumped into storage facilities. From these coastal storage facilities, the fuel had to be distributed to dozens of air bases scattered across Britain. Some fuel traveled by rail, loaded into specialized tank cars that could be emptied at airbase sidings. Some traveled by road, in tank trucks that navigated Britain's narrow roads, often at night to avoid German air attacks. Each airbase had to have adequate fuel storage, not just tanks to hold the fuel, but the infrastructure to keep it pure and uncontaminated. Underground storage tanks were used where possible because they provided protection against German bombing raids and kept the fuel at stable temperatures. Pumping stations moved the fuel from storage tanks to dispensing points where aircraft were fueled. Each of these systems had to be maintained, inspected regularly, protected against sabotage or accident. At the aircraft, ground crews pumped fuel into the Mustang's tanks using hand-operated or electrically driven fuel trucks. This was not a quick process. A Mustang's internal tanks held 184 gallons. Filling them from empty took 30 to 40 minutes. If external drop tanks were being installed, that added more time. The fuel had to be filtered during pumping to remove any water or particulates that might have contaminated it during storage or transport. Ground crews checked fuel samples visually, looking for water droplets or foreign matter. They tested fuel with special paste that changed color in the presence of water. All of this, the refining, the quality control, the transportation, the storage, the distribution, the fueling had to happen continuously, day after day, week after week, month after month. American industrial capacity in 1944 operated at levels that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers and would seem almost impossible to people today accustomed to lean just-in-time manufacturing. Factories produced bombers by the thousands, heavy four-engine aircraft that each required hundreds of thousands of precision-machined parts and hundreds of workers months to assemble. Fighters rolled off production lines by the tens of thousands. Shipyards launched Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, faster than Germany could sink them. Oil refineries produced not just aviation gasoline, but also motor gasoline for military vehicles, diesel fuel for trucks and tanks, heating oil, lubricants, and countless other petroleum products. This resulted from decades of industrial development that preceded the war. It resulted from vast natural resources, from oil fields and refineries built when America was still at peace. It resulted from a protected homeland safe from enemy bombers, allowing factories to run at full capacity without fear of destruction. It resulted from a workforce that included millions of women who took factory jobs traditionally held by men, proving that they could rivet aircraft fuselages, assemble engines, inspect parts, and perform every other task that industrial warfare required. The Royal Air Force's use of 150-grade fuel paralleled American use. British squadrons flying Spitfire 14s, Tempest Vs, and Mustang 3s and IVs received priority allocations. RAF pilots reported the same performance improvements Americans experienced. Some British pilots, familiar with the earlier 100 and 130-grade fuels, described the improvement from 130 to 150 as comparable to the original leap from 87 octane to 100 octane back in 1940. The difference was that dramatic. Tempest squadrons became particularly identified with V-1 interception success. The Tempest was a big, brutish aircraft, powered by a massive Napier Sabre engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. On 150-grade fuel, Tempests were fast enough to catch V-1s reliably, and powerful enough to climb quickly to intercept altitude. Between June and September 1944, RAF 150 Wing Tempests shot down 638 V-1 flying bombs. Number 3. Squadron claimed 305 victories. Squadron leader Joseph Berry shot down 59 V-1s personally, an incredible achievement that required not just flying skill, but incredible endurance, mission after mission after mission, sometimes flying multiple sorties in a single day. Belgian ace squadron leader Remy van Lierde destroyed 44 V-1s flying Tempests. Wing commander Roland Beaumont destroyed 31. These numbers represented not just destroyed missiles, but also London neighborhoods that weren't hit, civilian casualties that didn't happen, terror attacks that failed. Every V-1 shot down over the English Channel or over open countryside was a V-1 that didn't hit a school or a hospital or an apartment building full of families. The fuel that powered the interceptors was, in a very real sense, saving British civilian lives every day. By March 1945, virtually every Allied fighter unit in Europe was running 150-grade fuel as their standard operational fuel. The transition was complete. What had been experimental a year earlier was now routine. Combat reports from this period show overwhelmingly one-sided results. German fighters rarely challenged Allied formations effectively. When they did fight, they usually suffered disproportionate losses. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, which had been formidable in 1943, which had inflicted serious casualties on Allied bomber formations throughout that year, was by early 1945 a shadow of its former self. April 1945 missions over Germany often encountered no aerial opposition at all. Allied fighters would fly escort missions, arrive at the target area, circle while the bombers did their work, and return home without seeing a single German aircraft. This wasn't because German fighters didn't exist. Thousands were sitting on airfields, dispersed in forests, hidden in underground factories. But they sat grounded because there was no fuel to fly them. The few that did fly were often piloted by barely trained pilots who'd had minimal flight time because there hadn't been fuel for adequate training. These unfortunate pilots, many of them teenagers, flew against American pilots who'd had hundreds of hours of training before entering combat and who'd survived dozens or hundreds of combat missions. The outcomes were predictable and tragic. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended with absolute Allied air supremacy so complete that German aircraft simply didn't contest the skies anymore. This supremacy had many causes. The P-51 Mustang's long range was crucial, allowing escorts to accompany bombers deep into Germany. American pilot training was excellent, producing aviators who were well prepared for combat. Allied numerical superiority was overwhelming, with the Allies eventually fielding thousands of fighters against hundreds of German aircraft. But the petroleum engineering advantage that 150-grade fuel provided was significant, a margin of superiority that made good aircraft exceptional and gave Allied pilots a confidence that they could engage German fighters on favorable terms regardless of the tactical situation. The purple-dyed gasoline represented accumulated technological and industrial might. It represented decades of petroleum chemistry research. It represented the industrial capacity to not just develop superior fuel, but to produce it at scales that beggar imagination. It represented secure supply lines that could move millions of gallons of fuel across an ocean infested with enemy submarines. It represented ground crews who could handle toxic chemicals safely day after day. It represented pilots who could use the performance advantage intelligently, knowing when to use maximum power and when to conserve fuel. It represented, in short, the complete package of advantages that industrialized nations with vast resources and protected homelands could bring to bear against enemies who lacked those advantages. The combat effectiveness of 150-grade fuel was proven repeatedly through late 1944 and early 1945. Fighter groups that received the new fuel reported increased victory claims and reduced losses. By March 1945, virtually every P-51 unit was running the fuel. Combat reports from this period show overwhelmingly one-sided results. German fighters rarely challenged Allied formations effectively. When they did fight, they usually suffered heavy losses. April 1945 missions over Germany often encountered no aerial opposition. The Luftwaffe was finished, destroyed by attrition, fuel shortages, and the systematic elimination of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The air war over Europe ended with absolute Allied air supremacy. This supremacy had many causes. The P-51 Mustang's long range was crucial. American pilot training was excellent. Allied numerical superiority was overwhelming. But the petroleum engineering advantage that 150-grade fuel provided was significant. The purple-dyed gasoline turned good fighters into exceptional fighters, gave Allied pilots confidence, and represented the accumulated technological and industrial might of nations that could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outlast their opponents. Speed matters in aerial combat. A faster fighter can choose when to engage and when to escape. A faster fighter has tactical flexibility that slower opponents lack. When American fighters became demonstrably faster through the combination of excellent airframe design and superior fuel, the Luftwaffe's tactical options narrowed dramatically. The contrast between German and Allied situations in late 1944 and early 1945 was stark. Allied fighters could fly multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and aircraft maintenance. German fighters often sat grounded for lack of fuel. When they did fly, they operated under strict fuel conservation measures that limited combat capability. A German pilot who burned too much fuel in combat might not have enough to return to base. An Allied pilot could use full power when needed, confident that adequate fuel reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility had strategic implications. Allied fighters could maintain standing patrols, react to threats aggressively, and sustain operations continuously. German fighters had to pick their moments carefully, conserve fuel rigidly, and often break off combat, not because they were losing, but because they were running low on fuel. Luftwaffe pilots flew knowing that every sortie might be their last, not because they might be shot down, but because there might not be fuel for another mission. Allied pilots, by contrast, flew with confidence born from material superiority. They knew their aircraft were fast, their fuel was plentiful, their support system was robust. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, better combat results, and higher survival rates. The story of 150 grade fuel is a story about industrial warfare. Victory belonged to the side that could produce not just more aircraft, but better performing aircraft. Not just adequate fuel, but superior fuel. Not just sufficient trained pilots, but an overwhelming surplus of well-trained pilots backed by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. American and British. Fuel chemists working in laboratories and refineries never flew combat missions over Germany. They never faced flak or enemy fighters, but their work, measured in performance numbers and manifold pressure readings, helped decide who controlled the skies over Europe in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed his throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge ahead with power that German fighters could not match, he was benefiting from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into a fuel that made the exceptional routine. German planners had assumed American fighters would perform within predictable parameters based on aircraft design and standard fuel capabilities. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by a fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could not counter. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies overran Germany from east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. A few units still flew, often with barely enough fuel for a single sortie. Jet fighters like the Me-262 represented a technological leap forward. But they came too late and in too few numbers, handicapped by fuel shortages and the absence of experienced pilots who had been systematically destroyed in combat. The final accounting shows the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 groups across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties. They claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These numbers represented not just aircraft destroyed, but also pilots killed, experience lost, and German industrial capacity wasted building replacements that were themselves destroyed before achieving strategic effect. 150 grade fuel was not solely responsible for this outcome, but it was a significant contributing factor. It represented the margin of superiority that made the difference between a close fight and a decisive victory. The 448 miles per hour that a properly boosted P-51 could achieve represented not just velocity but also technological superiority and industrial capacity. This is what German planners had not anticipated, that American fuel chemists and petroleum engineers working far from any battlefield could create a weapon as effective as any gun or bomb. That purple-dyed gasoline could influence aerial combat as surely as superior tactics or better training. That the key to air supremacy over Europe in 1945 would involve the compression ratios of piston engines, the anti-knock properties of aromatic hydrocarbons, and the performance numbers of aviation fuels that exceeded anything Germany could produce. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1944 were remarkable aircraft. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1945 were the same aircraft, but they were powered by fuel that made them faster, more powerful, and more effective. That difference, measured in octane numbers and performance ratings, in manifold pressure readings and airspeed indicators, was one of the many differences that decided who would win the war for Europe's skies. In that decision lay the fate of Nazi Germany, and the demonstration of Allied industrial might expressed as a purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks, burned in powerful engines and transformed into victory, one combat mission at a time.